Okay, I think we've got slides up for everybody to see now, and I did start the recording. Thanks again, Diane. So off we go. We're going to talk today about this locomotive that you're looking at, Santa Maria Valley number 205. As it turns out, it's kind of an extension of last week's parlor car chat where we had Rob and Nathan talking about what's going on at the Santa Maria Valley Railroad these days, and that was kind of fun. And so now this is on the list, mainly because I had a bunch of pictures that we took when we went on a Santa Maria Valley business excursion trip up to Portland, which is where this locomotive is located, more or less, just outside of Portland, Oregon, and has been quite a while undergoing a restoration project, which we'll talk about here as things go on. Just for a housekeeping note, if you do have, since I've turned all your microphones off for the time being, if you have a question or you want to make a comment, add a correction, whatever, use the chat facility, which you can turn on in the controls that are around the screen you're looking at somewhere. It says the word chat in a little bubble or something like that. You can use that to ask questions, make comments, etc. In fact, somebody just did. Somebody is not getting audio, I think it was. Yeah, it's probably at your end. I think all our audio has been tested. So, Jim, I think it was, you might check around with your own audio controls. All right, okay, let's get going here. Santa Maria Valley number 205, pictured there as it sat at the Santa Maria Fairgrounds for the longest time, 1950 through 1983, was a 262 wheel arrangement built in 1923 by the Baldwin Locomotive Company. And as we go along here, we'll do a little bit of the history, take a look at what it was looking like in 2015, and then give us a little bit of an update on where it's been. Back when steam was big on the Santa Maria Valley, this picture was taken just outside the Roundhouse in downtown Santa Maria. And the main locomotive in the picture is number 21, which we're not going to talk about very much today, if at all, but rather number 205, which is sitting there behind it, that little locomotive in the back on the left. Here's a picture of the 205 as it was running on the Santa Maria Valley Railroad. So this picture had to have been sometime between 1933, when the railroad acquired the locomotive, and 1950, which is the year that it moved over to the fairgrounds. It was donated, I forget the name of the organization to whom it was donated, but they chose to have it displayed with the fairgrounds. And here's a picture of the number 205 and its tender being loaded onto a flatbed truck in 1983 to start its journey to Oregon, which is where it went in 1983 to George Lavacotte up there in his Lavacotte Locomotive Works, and that's when the restoration project could be started. I'm not sure when he actually started it, but that's when it could have started. By the way, I forgot to mention the original history of this locomotive. It was built by Baldwin in 1923. We mentioned that. But what I didn't mention or failed to mention was it was owned or originally purchased by the San Joaquin and Eastern Railroad, who had it then from when it was built until 1933, which is when the Santa Maria Valley Railroad acquired it, and used it until 1950 when it went to the fairgrounds. And then in 1983, which is what we're looking at here, it was moved from the fairgrounds to George Lavicott's facilities up in near Portland, Oregon, and that's where it's been ever since, as far as I know, unless it's moved in the last year or two. And interestingly enough, it's always been number 205. When San Joaquin and Eastern had it, it was 205. When Santa Maria Valley acquired it, that they didn't change it. It obviously didn't change when it was on display at the fairgrounds as an ex-Santa Maria Valley railroad locomotive. And George, at least so far, has chosen not to change it again. I realized as I was putting this together how much I use this particular book in terms of local railroading in Santa Maria Valley area. So I just thought I'd make sure anybody who's on here today is aware of this. Hal Madsen, he was a good friend of the railroad, was on the board, I think, for a while, worked with the Friends of the Santa Maria Valley Railroad. He wrote this book, published in 2001, and it's got all kinds of great information about the Santa Maria Valley Railroad, as well as the Pacific Coast Railway down in the Santa Maria area, and the Feedlot Railroad, which was yet technically a third railroad that operated down there. The book is still available. It can be found out there. Like I just checked on Amazon this morning. You could get copies for about 40 bucks used. New ones were 147. That's pretty darn expensive. And at one time, I know Friends of the Railroad had copies available. I don't know if they still do or not. It hasn't been reprinted for quite some time, so unless people have old backstocks, it's not available. So anyway, just FYI on that. In 2014, the locomotive number 205 had gotten far enough along in its restoration that they had a boiler test by the Federal Railroad FRA. And one of the pictures that was taken at that time, on the far right there, has that little stuffed pig sitting on top of the pressure gauge in the cab of the locomotive. And it's a reminder to me to mention, and to all of you, if you think about this ever again, Porky was, for some reason, I never really heard the whole story, the nickname of number 205. So not too long after that, that boiler inspection in 2014, number 205 was successfully steamed up in early 2015 for a test firing, of course. And not too long after that, in July, is when the Santa Maria Valley Group, a business excursion by the Santa Maria Valley Railroad and some of the Friends of the railroad and so on, went up to Portland. And we, among other things, got to visit George's facilities there. And so a bunch of these pictures now, that's what this is going to be, is our visit to that facility in 2015. Here's the locomotive sitting in his shop. This is where it generally sits, I gather, for all of its restoration work. And of course, it's where it sat all day while we were there. Let me see, hang on just a second. All right, there's the front end of number 205 in a little bit closer detail, with the number plate on the front, and the number board at the top there by the stack. The builder plate you can see on the side of the locomotive, basically underneath the bell. That's what it looked like in 2015. You get a little better picture closer up of some of those things. And there's a couple of shots of the builder plate and the number plate. And that's George Lavicott on the right, the gentleman who has been doing all this restoration work, and of course Rob Himoto, the president of the Santa Maria Valley Railroad, on the left. They're looking through. George had quite the stack of photographs of number 205 to work with, and schematics and all that sort of thing that if you're trying to restore a locomotive, you need. And there's Kevin and Rob. Kevin on the left, he's one of the Friends organizers all the time, has been for a long time, does a lot of field trips. Anyway, the two of them are standing there in the cab. And before I forget to mention it, the cab is one of the things that was entirely rebuilt, I understand. It was not in any kind of shape to fix up, so to speak, when it finally made it to the restoration facility in Oregon. So it was pretty much rebuilt. There's the backhead in the cab, all those controls. I particularly like the tennis ball, that kind of orange and blue thing to keep you from running into whatever rod that is that's sticking out from the controls. A little bit closer view. There's a side view on the left, side view down the length of the locomotive from the cab. And then on the right-hand side, from the ground, a shot of part of the running gear for this locomotive as it looked in 2015. And there's George opening up the front end of the locomotive so you can see into the workings of the firebox exchange and the pipe going up the stack and so on. And there's Rob sticking his head inside the locomotive. And on the right-hand side, the tail end of the tender, which obviously, of course, was also restored as part of the project. And here's a shot from the other side, kind of a long shot of I guess what would be the right-hand side of the locomotive. And a little bit more of the drive gear. I think those are 56-inch wheels. I remember that. Hopefully I remember that right. There's a little close-up shot of the builder's plate mounted on the side of the locomotive. I can't imagine what a project like this really entails. I mean, it's just all kinds of work, and it's not like you can go down to the hardware store and get many of these parts. There's kind of a shot of the various pictures and so on that George has been working with and collecting over the years for this locomotive. And I think I've got a couple here. I took a picture of a picture a few times. Yeah, there's one of the pictures he had of 205 sitting in Santa Maria. Obviously before 1950. And there's a not so great quality-wise, but interesting photo from 1983. This was part of the move that the locomotive made from the fairgrounds by tractor trailer to the Guadalupe Railroad Yard, and then by flat car from Guadalupe on up to Portland for George to get a hold of. And you can see there one of the two yellow cars further up the train, one of the Santa Maria Valley cabooses and one of the Santa Maria Valley 70 tonners, which the picture is a little too blurry to be able to find any kind of number or anything. Okay, there's a little bit bigger or wider shot of the locomotive sitting in George's facility. That might be one of the few shots I have that you at least get the whole locomotive. And the shot from underneath, well, I mean, you'd have to get that too, right? Sitting over at quite the pit for working underneath the locomotive. And then a shot from the rear that gets a little bit more of the tender photographed for us. There were some interesting cosmetic things that had to be done, and I remember George describing these in kind of in great detail, like removing paint from when it had been painted a different color somewhere along the line, and just between the paint that had to be removed and rust that had to be fixed, quite a project. On the right-hand side on this screen, you can see the woodwork. There was all kinds of new woodwork for the cab and other parts of the locomotive that had to be done from scratch because that had long since deteriorated beyond the point of usability. There's a shot through all the equipment, or some of the equipment in his shop there towards the locomotive. There's a picture of one of those charts that I was talking about when I said George was flipping through page after page of pictures and diagrams and schematics of that he had gathered up in order to be able to restore this locomotive. A lot of cosmetic work and cosmetic restoration went into this too to make everything look good. We must have climbed around in that facility for 2 or 3 hours, just poking over everything. Outside at George's facility was this tender and tank car. The tender is what we're focusing on here. This is the tender for 205's sister locomotive number 100, Santa Maria Valley number 100. Very similar to 205's, but obviously not yet in any kind of restored condition. You'll recall I mentioned that before our visit, the number 205 had its first steam up in like January or early 2015 anyway. We visited it in July of 2015, and then a couple months after that, in September of 2015, number 205 had its second steaming up since it left Santa Maria Valley Railroad in 1950. And then, in November of 2016, number 205 actually ran down the tracks under its own power. And And there's a really cool video of this. It's not very long, like I think well under a minute maybe, or about a minute. A video of this little run that the locomotive made out of the shop and down the track a little bit and back. And it's at that address. It's at the bottom of the picture, which will also be in the links back on the Parlor Car chat page of the museum. One of the things that we do after we have one of these presentations is provide a recording as soon as it's prepared that you can go to and see at any time again, or reference it for people if you want. And also that same place will have links to whatever I use to research this a little bit, or interesting things like this that you can actually watch and listen to that locomotive run. And that's kind of where I lost track of it. I have not been able to find out anything about what has happened since 2016 in regard to this locomotive. So if anybody happens to have, you can put it in the chat, or I'm going to open up for question and answers here in a second too, and we'll see. So that's all I've got to share with you on 205. This is just a reminder, final page, that you can always go to that Parlor Car Chats address at the top of the upper right-hand corner there to find out what's coming up, what's happened, links to previous recordings, or the links to join for future meetings. We, as usual, really appreciate if you would do the feedback survey so we know what you might be interested in, what you like, what you didn't like, does the time work, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll put in a little plug for next Saturday's Parlor Car Chat. Will be about a trip on the Royal Gorge, or up the Royal Gorge, on the Royal Gorge Route Railroad. And that's right here in my backyard. I live probably an hour away from Canyon City, which is where the Royal Gorge Route Railroad starts from. So let me turn everybody back on if you want to. If anybody wants to join in or ask a question or make a comment.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah.
David Andrew told me about 8 months ago George sold the 205 to, I believe it's the Oregon Eastern Railroad.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Is that a railroad it could be used on, or do you know what the intent is?
Yeah. It's definitely, I think it was that tourist railroad that we didn't go to. I think it's the one that has the 70-tonner, and they do excursions.
Oh, wow.
I believe.
Oregon Eastern, you said. Is that right, Rob? It's called the Oregon Eastern Railroad?
I think that's the one. You know, there's a whole bunch of those small Oregon railroads, but it's the one that runs excursions, freight and excursions. But they bought it from him about 8 months ago, and I know they plan to run it, but that's all I've heard since.
Well, that'd be really fun. If they ever actually get that running as an excursion, we'll have to go up there.
Yeah, for sure.
Jamie, is Kurt Johnson here?
Yeah.
One of the photos that you showed in the Santa Maria yard, 205 had a Vanderbilt tender behind it. Do you know anything about that?
Well, not much besides it must have had oil in it. Rob, do you happen to know, or anybody else?
Somewhere along the line before they took it over to the Fair Park, those tenders got switched, and I don't recall the whole story, but you know they swapped those tenders around, so they didn't have the original tender even at the Fair Park. Because remember, it went to the Fair Park, then it went to George in '83 or whatever year that was.
And George must have had the tender separately then.
No, it came together. What you see, that was, I believe that's what was in the fair park. I mean, I barely remember that. I just moved there when it was in the fair park.
Let's see if I can get back to that.
That was before my
yeah.
time.
Yeah, there's the picture of it moving in '83, and it has not the Vanderbilt tender, the other kind of original one. Any other comments, questions?
This is Bruce Morton. I had a couple of questions.
Oh, go ahead.
When you took the trip up there to see the 205, did you also run up to Astoria to see the 21?
No. Unfortunately, we didn't have time or chose not to do that. I don't remember which.
And the other question, you showed a tender and you said it was from the SMV 100. Do you know whether one of the Santa Maria Valley engines was out at Merrill with a bunch of other engines? Do you know where 100 is?
I do not. It's on at least the last information I know of is on the Friends of the Santa Maria Valley website, and it has kind of where things went. Rob, do you know offhand where 100 is?
Yes, 100 is in Merrill, Oregon. That's correct.
Yeah, I probably got some pictures. My daughter was one of her roommates' family lived in Merrill. We went up and visited, and of course, I wanted to go out and see the trains. So we did, took a few pictures, but they're just sitting out there on a track on the old Modoc line.
It's really surprising how many of those Santa Maria Valley steam locomotives are still someplace in some condition. There's quite a few of them around. Okay, any other comments, questions? Excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us again, and we will see you next week when we look at a trip up and down the Royal Gorge on the Royal Gorge Route Railroad. All right, thanks all.
Thanks, Jamie.